All right, so let's talk about multiplying and dividing radicals. So you can turn to page 5 in your packet, and we're first going to do 2 examples from page 5 with multiplying, and then we'll go to 2 examples of page 6 with dividing radicals. Okay, so when multiplying radicals, the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to multiply what's outside the radical. So if we take a look at number 1, we're going to want to multiply these numbers on the outside of the radical. So 8 times 1/2 is 4. Okay, then step 2 is to multiply what's inside the radical. So right here we have a radical 3 times a radical 15. That's going to give us radical 45. And then step number 3 is just to simplify. So to simplify this, let me bring the 4 down. And since 45 is not a perfect square, I'm going to break that up into 2 separate radicals. And the biggest perfect square that divides evenly into 45 is 9. So 9 times 5 is 45. So since the square root of 9 is 3, I'm just going to cross this off and make it a 3. And then we're just going to multiply the 4 times the 3. So 4 times 3 is 12. So that leaves us with 12 radical 5. All right, so let's jump ahead to number 6. Now in number 6, we have a binomial times another binomial. So when that happens, we know we have to double distribute. So I'm first going to take the 4 and distribute it to both terms in the second set of parentheses. All right, so 4 times 2 is 8. And then 4 times 7 radical 5. Well, we're going to multiply the numbers on the outside. So 4 times 7 is 28. So we have positive 28. And I'm just going to bring that radical 5 down because we don't have another radical to multiply it by. Okay, now I'm going to take the negative 3 radical 5 and distribute it to both terms. So negative 3 radical 5 times 2, we're going to multiply the numbers on the outside. So negative 3 times 2 is negative 6. And again, I'm going to bring down that radical 5. And then negative 3 radical 5 times positive 7 radical 5. Well, let's follow the rules for multiplying radicals. You multiply the numbers on the outside. So negative 3 times positive 7 is negative 21. And then radical 5 times radical 5 is radical 25. Okay, now let's take a look at this here. First thing, the radical 25, the square root of 25 is just 5. So I can just cross that off and make that a 5. And keep in mind, whenever you're multiplying 2 of the same radicals, whenever you're multiplying 2 of the same radicals, rad 5 times radical 5, it's really just going to give you that number that was under the radical. Because if you want to think about it as, if you have rad 5 times rad 5, isn't that really just rad 5 squared if you have 2 of them? And doesn't a square and a square root just cancel each other off, leaving you with 5? So if you want to skip steps, instead of writing this as radical 25, you could just make it a 5 right from the beginning. All right, so for right now, I'm just going to bring down my 8. I can combine 28 radical 5 and negative 6 radical 5 to give me positive 22 radical 5. And then over here, the negative 21 times 5 is negative 105. All right, and then I can just finish combining my like terms. 8 minus 105 is negative 97, so it leaves me with negative 97 plus 22 radical 5. All right, so now if you turn to page 6, we're going to take a look at number 9. All right, well, the same rules apply for dividing radicals as they do for multiplying radicals. You'll notice the only difference is here we're using the word divide instead of multiply. So step number 1, divide outside the radical. So if we look at these numbers outside the radical here, 24 divided by 48 is just 1/2. You could write that as 1/2 or 0.5, whatever you prefer. Okay, step number 2 is to divide inside the radical. And I just want to point something out. Even though radical 48 right here can simplify, I'm going to tell you to divide these two first before simplifying, because what's going to happen is if you simplify this, a lot of times you're going to have to simplify again in the end once you divide, so it just creates more steps. So it's easier to just take what's under the radicals and just divide them. So since 48 divided by 6 is 8, radical 48 divided by radical 6 is radical 8. And then from here, let's just simplify. Step number 3. So I'll bring down the 1/2. Since 8 is not a perfect square, I'm going to break that up into 2 separate radicals. That'll be radical 4 and radical 2. And since the square root of 4 is 2, I'll just cross that off and make it a 2. All right, so now let's just multiply 1/2 times 2, which is just 1. So that's going to leave us with 1 radical 2, which you could just write as radical 2. Okay, and the last one we're going to look at is number 12. Now, with number 12, since we have a binomial being divided by a monomial, we're going to have to individually divide the terms on top by 4 radical 2. So we're going to have to do this twice. All right, so when we take 8 radical 24 and divide it by 4 radical 2, well, 8 divided by 4 is 2, and radical 24 divided by radical 2 is radical 12. Okay, then I'll bring down my addition sign. 12 divided by 4 is 3, and radical 2 divided by radical 2 is just 1, so I don't even have to write that. All right, so from here, let's simplify. The radical 12 breaks up into radical 4 times radical 3, and I'll just bring down this plus 3. And since the square root of 4, again, is 2, I'm just going to multiply the 2 times 2 to give me 4. So I have 4 radical 3 plus 3. And these are not like terms. This has a radical on it, and this doesn't. So 4 rad 3 plus 3 is my final answer.